spending time here. His house is right up the hill here. They currently live in San Francisco, where Philip is a lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. And until he retired in 2008, he had been for really nearly 30 years a reporter and editor for the New York Times, specializing in national security issues, including United States diplomacy and intelligence and defense policy and operations, serving at various times as Washington correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, deputy editorial page editor, Washington bureau chief, and associate editor. He's the author of 3 books, The Partnership, 5 Cold Warriors and Their Quest to Ban the Bomb, which was published in 2012, Secret Empire, Eisenhower, the CIA, and the Hidden Story of America's Space Espionage, which he published in 2003. And his most recent work, and the topic for tonight, is a biography of George Shultz, In the Nation's Service, The Life and Times of George P. Shultz, which was published this year. He is currently working on a book about Robert McNamara. He's a 1970 graduate of Stanford University and served for many years as a member of its board of trustees and was board secretary for 7 years. A resume that you can go on and on about, but we're very lucky to have this distinguished speaker. And his book, he has copies of his books here and there. You're encouraged by them.
First of all, thank you all for coming. And what a nice place to talk about this book. It really feels like home to me here. I had the good fortune to meet Felicity in college. We got married shortly thereafter, and she introduced me to their home up here on Schoolhouse Ledge. And we've been coming up every year since, and I guess her family's been coming since 1955. Which I know by Northeast Harbor standards is actually a pretty short period of time. So as I talk a bit about George Shultz today, let me start by recalling that some of the characters you'll hear me speak about were your neighbors, and some of you may have known them. So Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, lived over as you probably know. I had the good fortune to see him here once at a Memorial Day parade where he came in an old Model T car and stood up on the back of a truck down by the tennis courts in the harbor to give a Memorial Day address. Paul Nitze, who lived up Schoolhouse Ledge, you'll also hear about today, worked very closely with George Shultz. And another neighbor who was an important figure in the preceding administration is Zbigniew Brzezinski, had a house here. His daughter still comes here, I believe. So let me start by giving you the kind of overview here, and then I'll back up and tell you the story of George Shultz's life and what he accomplished and how he accomplished it, which is really the most important thing, because the way he worked was typical of his generation, soldier, statesman. He fought in World War II in the Pacific as a Marine. An approach to governing that has all but disappeared in Washington today. So we'll take you back to an earlier era that will be familiar, I think, to many of you. But let me begin just by reading you a comment from Mikhail Gorbachev about George Shultz that kind of captures his significance, I think, as an historical figure. And this is what Gorbachev said: without Reagan, the Cold War would not have ended. But without Schultz, Reagan would not have ended the Cold War.
Wow.
And I think that the reason I did this book is that I think George Shultz was lost in history a little bit. He was overshadowed, obviously, by President Reagan. And he was not someone who sought the limelight. He did a book about his time as Secretary of State that came out 3 or 4 years after the Reagan administration ended. It wasn't widely read. It was a thick tome that was an incredibly detailed account of his service as secretary. And he stayed active through the remainder of his life. He died at age 100, just 2 years ago, out at Stanford. But he was kind of, in a way, a forgotten man from that period. So I'll go back, and working with Amy with the photographs here, we'll not pause on all of these. George Shultz, one other overarching fact of interest about him before I go into the details, there are only 2 people in American history who've served in 4 different cabinet posts. Elliot Richardson, some of you may have known him, and George Shultz. George Shultz, under President Nixon, served as Secretary of Labor. He was the original director, the inaugural director of the Office of Management and Budget when Nixon created that office, and then he was Nixon's Treasury Secretary. Went back to California, became the #2 official at the Bechtel Company, the big international construction company, and then Ronald Reagan brought him to Washington a year into the Reagan presidency, after Al Haig, the first Secretary of State, flamed out. So George was a single child. He grew up in New Jersey, just across the river from Manhattan. His father worked on Wall Street training brokers. He himself was not a broker. George had a very loving family life, and I think out of that, he gained a sense of confidence that served him well over the years. Here he is with his father at Kezar Stadium in San Francisco on a trip. We can go through some of these other slides if you don't mind, Amy. You'll see if we can change them. Okay, so he went to prep school in New England and then to Princeton, where he played on the football team. And actually, it was an important lesson at Princeton on the football team about leadership that he drew on for the rest of his career very effectively. He was injured his senior year. He had expected to start at running back, and instead he was sidelined. And he became the coach of the freshman running backs. In those days, as you will recall, there was a separate freshman team in colleges. And what Schultz said he learned from that experience was the importance of inclusiveness, teamwork, getting those other freshmen to work together, and most important, and very rare in Washington, a trait that he had, listening. Yeah. George Shultz was a great listener. You could go sit down with him, and instead of having him deliver a monologue, he would listen to you. And that was an important skill as he went on with his life. So World War II breaks out while he's at Princeton. He goes up to New York hoping to enlist in the Canadian military. He didn't want to wait to the United States to get, its forces arrayed around the world. He was rejected by the Canadian military because of bad eyesight. And people often ask me, especially Princeton graduates, is it true that George Shultz had a tiger tattoo on his butt? The answer I can confirm is yes. How do I know that? I know that because I found a letter that his buddy wrote after the two of them went to New York, after they got rejected by the Canadian military. What did Princeton undergraduates do at a point like that? They're in Manhattan, they get to have a few drinks, and then they go and they get tattooed. And this buddy of Schultz sent a letter to his father describing the whole thing. So that's how I know for sure that he did get this tattoo. So then he goes off to the Marine Corps. And fast forward a little bit. We'll skip this. This is his Princeton years. Here he is as a Marine officer. He was sent to the South Pacific. As the tide began to turn after the Japanese conquered all of those islands after the war began. And it was a slog, as many of you know, for the United States and its allies to retake those islands and bring the fight back up towards the Japanese homeland. And George got drawn into that fight. And another critical set of lessons for him in combat. There's a powerful scene in the book where he and his unit, they were an anti-aircraft unit, come under fire by Japanese airplanes. And they scatter. The bombs drop. Schultz comes back to find the sergeant, who is his right-hand person, and he sees another Marine where he had left the sergeant, and he says, "Where's Sergeant Patton?" And the Marine says, "Sergeant Patton is dead, sir." So the importance of combat, the need to use American power when necessary, but to use it with restraint when possible. And the lesson he took away from his sergeant, his drill sergeant in boot camp, was very simple, but he talked about it over and over and over again. The sergeant handed him the rifle, showed him how to take it apart, how to put it back together, and then told Schultz and his fellow Marines in boot camp, "Don't ever aim this rifle at anyone unless you're ready to pull the trigger." And the lesson for Schultz was no false threats. If you're going to threaten the use of American force, you got to be ready to deliver it. You don't threaten it and then not use it. So he comes out of the war a changed man. He finds a young woman, nurse in Hawaii, whom he falls in love with, and they get married. If we go up a little bit, there they are on their wedding day, George and Obi. And then he goes to MIT, gets his PhD in economics, becomes a junior faculty member at MIT. He's a labor economist. And then the University of Chicago calls up, invites him to come out and teach at the business school. Before that, he serves for a year on President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors in a staff role. But it's another important moment for Schultz because the chair of the council at that time was Arthur Burns. Later, Arthur Burns becomes Fed chair when George Schultz is Treasury Secretary. So it's an important friendship that is developed in that 1 year that he was in Washington in the Eisenhower administration. He becomes dean of the Graduate School of Business at Chicago. He gets involved in a number of civil rights activities. It's an important insight into him. I won't dwell on it, but he made a concerted effort and a successful effort to further the integration of the Chicago Business School. Very few people of color were students at that time. Under his leadership, they brought in many more. He also worked at that time to advance civil rights in unions. There's a wonderful story of how the Meatpackers Union was being reorganized, and George, dean at Chicago, goes down to Fort Worth to work on this with representatives of management and labor in the meatpacking industry. They get to their hotel in Fort Worth, and Schultz goes up to the desk and they register him. His colleague from the business school faculty comes up, they register him. The union representative is Black, comes up to the desk, and the clerk says, "I'm sorry, sir, we have no reservation for you." Schultz says, "Check again." The clerk checks again and said, no, we have no reservation for you. Schultz says, how many beds in my room? The clerk says, 2. Put them in my room. And they did. That was the integration of that hotel, forced by George Schultz at the moment. That was an insight into how he operates. Okay, in 1968, he goes out to Stanford on sabbatical. Nixon's running for president. Arthur Burns, who is advising Nixon on economic policy, says, you got to meet this rising star in labor economics. And so they bring Schultz in to advise the Nixon campaign on labor issues. Nixon's elected. He offers Schultz the job of labor secretary. Interesting moment here, too. Nixon invites him down to LA. He's now president-elect to talk to Schultz. Schultz goes down. He's already, the nomination hasn't been announced, but Nixon's already invited him to take the job. Schultz meets him at the hotel, and he says afterward, it was a very peculiar meeting. I came away uneasy about Nixon because I went into the room expecting him to interrogate me about what I wanted to do as secretary, and he didn't. And instead, I had to ask him a lot of questions about what he wanted to do as president involving labor relations. And Schultz left that meeting and thought, this guy is a little peculiar. And, you know, as he learned later, that was certainly true. And although, of course, Nixon was, you know, very successful in many ways as president. Okay, George comes to Washington to be labor secretary. And at the press conference in which he announces his appointees, all the top positions at the Department of Labor's 10 positions, he goes down the list one by one. Not a single Republican. They're all Democrats or independents. He gets back to his hotel and the phone rings in his room, and it's one of Nixon's aides saying, George, what the hell are you doing? You're supposed to appoint Republicans. This is a Republican administration. So the insight here, and this you'll see played out during his time as Secretary of State, he believes in making policy based on the best people, nonpartisan, bipartisan, and non-ideological. Those are themes of George Schultz's service in public office. So as labor secretary, he gets involved in an extraordinary effort that most people have unaware of. Nixon was of two minds about civil rights issues. Some of you may remember he ran a kind of campaign trying to swing Southern Democratic voters over to the Republican Party. And to do that, he played on some kind of racist themes that were done in a kind of subtle way, but an effective way. But he also believed that you had to follow the decisions of the Supreme Court. And the court had ordered the integration of schools. So he appoints Spiro Agnew to head a committee, a commission to do this. Agnew wants nothing to do with it. Agnew, remember, had been governor of Maryland, a border state. Checks out. Schultz, the deputy head of the commission, takes over. In the course of the next 2 years, under Schultz's leadership, Southern urban school systems in the southern states went from 80% segregated to 20% segregated. That was because of George Schultz. Most people don't know that. And the way he did it was also typical of Schultz. He had a wonderful formula for solving problems. And if you take nothing else away from this talk today, take this home with you. George Schultz was the consummate pragmatic problem solver. That was his great skill. And he applied it with the school systems. What they did was to bring up delegations from each of the southern states, one by one, to the White House. Half people of color, half white. They brought them in. They sat them down. Attorney General Mitchell came in and said, you need to desegregate your schools voluntarily. He turned it over to George Shultz. And at the first meeting with the delegation from Mississippi, which they figured was going to be the most difficult state to get to integrated schools, they sat down, and the white men, by the way, there was just men in the room, of course, in that era. The white men looked at the men of color in that room, and they used words I'm not going to use here today to talk to them. Racial epithets right there in the White House to those people. So you can imagine the tension in the room. Schultz meets with them for an hour. They begin to talk, and Schultz gets up and starts to walk out. And the White House aide who had been assigned to work with him grabs him by the shoulder and says, Mr. Secretary, what are you doing? They're just starting to talk. He said, that's the point. They have to talk to each other. If they talk to me, they'll never solve this problem. And so he left them in there. They spent the whole afternoon talking to one another in the White House. And by the end of the day, they had agreed to desegregate the schools in Mississippi. Now, of course, it wasn't complete desegregation. Problems with our schools and racial issues persist to this day. But for those 2 years, major progress was made, and it was due largely to George Shultz. Okay, now let's move up through the photos. I don't want to leave behind too many. So here he is being sworn in as Secretary of Labor. Here he is. Many of you, this is Schultz, many of you will remember George Meany with the dark glasses sitting next to Nixon. He was the president of the AFL-CIO, the most powerful labor leader in the country. Next slide, please. Here he is with Nixon and his mentor on economic policy, Milton Friedman. This was a very important figure to George Shultz, a free marketer. Schultz believed vehemently in the importance of free markets, okay? Here he is as Treasury Secretary with Alexander Hamilton, okay? Here he is at Bechtel with a hard hat. Go ahead, okay, and now we get to the Reagan administration. Reagan comes to Washington, as you will recall, with a lot of hard rhetoric about the Soviet Union. Remember some of those famous lines, communism will wind up on the ash heap of history. The Soviet Union is the evil empire. Later, with Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall in Berlin. Very harsh anti-Soviet rhetoric, a huge military buildup, investing billions of dollars, by the way, with the concurrence of Democrats and Republicans in Congress, to strengthen the American military. Adopted the Star Wars initiative, the Strategic Defense Initiative, to build a space-based missile defense system to block incoming Soviet missiles if theoretically they could do that. Schultz comes into Washington a year into the Reagan administration. Haig is fired. The advisors around Schultz, including Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary, are hardliners about the Soviet Union. Schultz himself is a hardliner in the sense that he believes the military buildup is important. He believes that the Cold War is a do or die conflict, basically, between East and West and capitalism and communism. When you hear the rest of what I'm going to say, I don't want you to think that he was somehow soft on communism. He wasn't, but he was a realist. So he comes into office, and I didn't learn this until I was finished with the book, and I was in Washington in January, and Bob Woodward at the Post very kindly interviewed me at a book event in Washington. And he told me that night that not long after George Shultz became Secretary of State, he, Bob Woodward, was invited to a dinner at Katharine Graham's house, the publisher of the Washington Post. And Bob was seated next to Obie Schultz, George's wife. And he turned to Obie and he said, tell me, what does your husband, what are his goals as Secretary of State? And without missing a beat, she says to Bob, end the Cold War. End the Cold War. We're talking about 1982. You know, the Cold War is at its height. The United States and Soviet Union together at that point in history have 70,000 nuclear weapons together. And George Shultz is coming to Washington and saying, let's end the Cold War. I mean, who are you kidding? So the people around Reagan do not want to try to improve relations, or if they can be improved only on total US terms. Weinberger, Gene Kirkpatrick, the ambassador of the United Nations, William Casey, the CIA director, and the national security advisor are all opposed to improving relations with the Soviet Union. So Schultz, for the first 2 years, keeps trying to talk to Reagan about initiating diplomatic overtures to try to reduce tensions, try to not end the Cold War immediately. He understood that was impossible, but try to reduce tensions. And every time he goes to the White House, he's rebuffed, not so much by Reagan as by Bill Clark, the national security advisor, because what happens is George says, I want a meeting with the president. And he's invited over to the Oval Office. And when he gets there, who's there? Ronald Reagan, Caspar Weinberger, Bill Casey, Gene Kirkpatrick, Bill Clark. And every time he tries to explain what he's trying to do, he's basically shut down. And there's a remarkable document that lays all this out, which you'll see in my book if you take a look at it. There is an incredible diary that was kept by his executive assistant as Secretary of State, a guy named Raymond Seitz, who later went on to be U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Ray Seitz was his right-hand person. He sat in the office right next to Schultz. He was there with Schultz every day, and Schultz would come back and confide in him everything that he had seen and heard when he went to the White House, or the Defense Department, elsewhere. Ray Seitz kept a diary. It's an extraordinary document, which I had exclusive access to. It was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and Schultz, in encouraging me to do this book, said, I'll give you exclusive access to my papers at Hoover, and I found this document. And you'll see in the book, over and over and over again, Schultz comes back from the White House, pulling out his hair. At one point, he says to Ray Seitz, he says, oh, I desperately need a meeting with the President of the United States to talk about US-Soviet policy. I mean, how can this be? The Secretary of State cannot get a meeting one-on-one with the President of the United States to talk about Soviet policy? He couldn't. So what changed? Two things. There was a huge blizzard in Washington in February of '83. The Reagans couldn't get up to Camp David where they had planned to go. They had nothing on the calendar. So that was the first thing, Mother Nature. The second thing, Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan understood that her husband was getting advice from hardliners, and she was fearful that her husband would go down in history regarded as a warmonger, someone who had inflamed the Cold War rather than reducing tensions. She was acutely sensitive to the legacy of her husband. And she understood that Schultz could be her ally, her most important ally in helping her husband move toward a different relationship with the Soviet Union. And she knew something actually that George Schultz didn't know when he became Secretary of State, which was that Ronald Reagan actually wanted to do that. So when you go back through the records, you find these extraordinary documents. I'll tell you about one. This was before Schultz became Secretary of State. Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, sends him a boilerplate letter. It's kind of propaganda, Soviet propaganda. They said this all the time, you know, we want a peaceful coexistence. We don't need to be, enemies, blah, blah, blah. You know, you read something like that at the time and you thought this is just BS from the Kremlin. Reagan reads the letter and he says, oh, that's very interesting. So the State Department gives him a response, a kind of boilerplate response. And he says, no, I don't want to send that letter. I want to send a different letter that's more responsive to Brezhnev's call for peace. So the State Department produces a barely changed version of the letter. They give it to Reagan. He said, no, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to write a letter myself, and then you're going to send my letter and your letter. And if you go back and look at this letter, it's an extraordinary document. It's handwritten by Reagan. And it's almost childish in its innocence. It talks about how the Soviet people and the American people have no reason to be adversaries, that they are peace-loving peoples, and that the world should be a better, safer place. I mean, Al Haig was just, stunned by this. He couldn't believe that Reagan wanted to send this letter. But that was actually an insight into something about Reagan, which is that he actually wanted to wind down the Cold War. And so it was with Schultz as his key advisor that he was able to do that. And what you see in the book is there were these 2 years of frustration, many resignation threats by Schultz, but eventually, with Nancy Reagan's help, he wins the trust of Reagan, and then, of course, they get the advantage, historical, unique moment in world history when you look back on it. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes Soviet leader. And so suddenly, this line of dying Kremlin leaders is gone, and there's a 54-year-old dynamic man taking over who also wants to wind down the Cold War, partly because he believes that it's a waste of energy and money, partly because he believes the Soviet Union can't keep up with the United States militarily, partly because he understands the Soviet economy is in a stupor, which it was. My wife and I lived there at the time with our 2 sons, one of whom is here. He was only 4 at the time. And it took us about a month living in Moscow to see that the Soviet Union was basically a developing country with a massive nuclear arsenal. And Gorbachev understood this imbalance. The consumer goods, there were no consumer goods. People, the joke, Reagan used to tell it all the time. It's true. It captures the situation. There was a huge, anytime there was food in the store, people lined up for it. They got at the back of the line. They didn't even know what was in the store, but if they saw a line, they figured there must be something good. And so the joke goes, this guy gets in line, he's waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally he says to the guy in front of him, hey, this is ridiculous. I'm going to the Kremlin and I'm going to assassinate Gorbachev because Gorbachev had restricted the sale of vodka. An hour later, he comes back, gets back at the end of the line, and the guy in front of him who saw him off said, so what happened? Did you kill him? He said, no, that line was even longer. But Reagan loved to tell this joke. He actually, can you imagine, he could not have possibly told it to Brezhnev or Andropov or Chernenko, whom he never met, but he did tell it to Gorbachev. But let me circle back and explain how it was that George Shultz came to believe that you could negotiate with the Soviet Union. So story number 1, he goes to the Soviet Union as Treasury Secretary. He brings along his wife, Obi. She was a nurse. She goes to a hospital, comes back and reports to her husband, you can't believe the state of medical care in this country. It's like 19th century medical care, which in fact was true. Felicity and I could see this. I toured a hospital. I once went to a dental clinic. I mean, my God, I fled because, they were still using, pulleys to drive the drills, and they didn't have Novocaine. They did not have Novocaine. So he listens to that and he thinks, so what kind of country is this? Then he goes to Leningrad with a real stony, hard-edged minister, a kind of Stalinist figure. They fly up to Leningrad together, and Schultz, like anybody visiting Leningrad or today St. Petersburg, says, I'd like to go to the Hermitage and see the great art. And the minister says, we'll go there, but first we're going to the cemetery. So they went to the cemetery. You've probably been there, right? No? Anybody else been? Yeah. So it's a powerful place because it's mass graves. Yeah, there are 1,000 people in each mass grave. And you walk down this path between these mass graves. And Schultz is walking down this path with a minister and a translator. And at a certain point, he realizes the translator stopped translating. He turns around, she's weeping. And then he realizes the minister, this Stalinist figure, is also weeping. So George, at the end of this tour, goes up on a terrace that overlooks these mass graves, goes up to the front of it and gives a Kriegsmarine salute and says, you know, you mourn your dead with the same sense of humanity and loss that we Americans mourn the loss of our citizens in war. This had a huge impact because the minister went back to Moscow and told people that George Shultz, the US Treasury Secretary, had come over there and shown a reverence for the dead Soviet citizens. It created a kind of understanding for Schultz that you could talk to these people. Yet, yes, they were communists. Yes, they had this massive nuclear arsenal. Yes, at a moment's notice, they could obliterate the United States, but they were also human beings, and we should talk to them. And so that's, in effect, what he did. He had the benefit, obviously, of Gorbachev, who came in, was a game-changing figure. And you had the benefit of Edward Shevardnadze, who Gorbachev appointed as Soviet foreign minister, replacing the implacable Andrei Gromyko, who had served in that job for 30 years, never cracked a smile. And Shevardnadze was this kind of ebullient, gregarious Georgian. The Georgian people are wonderful. I go to Georgia whenever I can. I also go to our Georgia, but the Georgia in Central Asia is a special place. Great food, great wine, great cognac, great people. And Shevardnadze had that kind of wonderful quality. And so they struck up a friendship that was like no other, I think, during the Cold War, without a doubt. And the way it started is Shevardnadze is appointed. Let's go through some photos to get to the end. This is with Nancy Reagan. You can see the rapport between Schultz and the First Lady. That tells you everything you need to know about that relationship. Okay. Here he is with Gorbachev. Shevardnadze is the gentleman with the white hair next to Gorbachev, and that is Dobrinin, who had been their longtime Soviet ambassador in Washington, and this, of course, is Schultz. So Shevardnadze is appointed, and Schultz knows he's going to meet him for the first time in Helsinki at a big international conference. And he wasn't planning to take Obi with him, but he says to Obi, let's go together. Maybe we can establish a different kind of relationship with Shevardnadze and his wife. So he arrives in the hall. It's Finlandia Hall, this huge interior amphitheater. And the delegations were seated in French. So the American delegation was in the front row, États-Unis, and the Soviet Union was in the back. He comes in, he puts his briefing papers on the table in the front row, turns around and walks up those steps one by one. There are a lot of them. The hush falls over the hall. He gets up to the Soviet delegation and extends his hand to Shevardnadze. That was the beginning of a friendship that changed the course of history. There is no doubt about it. The two of them together were the negotiators, essentially, that wound down the Cold War. Of course, they couldn't have done it without Reagan and Gorbachev. Ultimately, it's Reagan and Gorbachev's triumph, but it really is Schultz and Shevardnadze who conducted hundreds of hours of negotiations over a whole range of issues from arms control to regional issues in places like Angola and the Middle East and elsewhere. And I went over to Tbilisi to interview Shevardnadze. He was sadly deep into Parkinson's disease. But he greeted me warmly, and then he somehow with 2 aides managed to get up and come over and sit on a sofa next to me. And he instructed an aide to go across his big office and bring some papers that were over there. She brought them over, gave them to Shevardnadze. He looked at them and handed them to me. These were the Christmas cards that George and his second wife sent to Shevardnadze and his wife. And Shevardnadze says to me, I treasure my friendship with George Shultz. And in a letter he wrote to Schultz in 1989, after Schultz left office, he referred to him, I found this in the archives at Stanford, he referred to their relationship as that of, quote, kindred souls. I mean, can you imagine any US Secretary of State having Andre Gromyko write such a letter? Inconceivable. So that is really the story of George Shultz. Look, he was not flawless. Nobody is. Some of you may wonder what happened at the end of his life with Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. It was a tragic chapter in George's life. He was seduced by her, not physically, but he basically fell in love with her, I think. He was persuaded her blood testing technology was transformative. It was a fraud. He didn't know it. But when it was shown to be a fraud by his grandson, among others, instead of embracing Tyler, his grandson, and standing by him, he continued to support Elizabeth Holmes, who, as you know, is now in prison. So this was a last sad chapter of George Shultz's life. There were other chapters you'll find in the book involving the Iran-Contra affair and Watergate, in which he played a less than noble role. I can go into that in answering questions if you like. And the last years of his life were quite remarkable, I need to tell you. He lived another 30 years. And these were incredibly active years in which he came to believe in climate change, persuaded by scientists at Stanford and MIT. And he and Jim Baker co-authored an article calling for a carbon tax. I sat at his conference table 2 years before COVID hit. And for 3 hours, he had biomedical experts talking about the impending threat of a global pandemic. I mean, it was just extraordinary. I sat at his table in the last months of his life when he sat down with a bunch of us and a demographics expert and said, you've got to understand what's going on in Japan and China. The population is aging out. They don't have enough people to do the work that they need in those countries. This is going to have a transformative effect on the world economy. And look out for Africa, he said. Population growth is burgeoning there. Fast forward 50 years, the continent of Africa is going to be an incredibly powerful economic engine in the world. These were things that George Shultz was talking about in his 90s. So an extraordinary life. Let me close by saying, we all hear the word patriot tossed around. It's been tossed around a lot in recent years and used in ways that, at least to me, have no bearing on what real patriotism is. If you're looking for a real American patriot, I think George Shultz is a good model. He served his country in war. He served his country in public service. He tried to solve intractable problems. He was non-ideological. He believed fervently in the Republican Party, although at the end of his life, he didn't recognize the Republican Party that existed. But he believed fervently in the Republican Party for years. But when it came to looking for solutions to national and international problems. He looked for ways where you could cross the aisle and come up with some kind of solution. So let me end there. Happy to take some questions. Thank you. It's always hard to get the first person to ask a question. Yes, Bob.
Bringing you to the current day with your familiarity with Russia and all of that, what do you make of it?
Well, we're in a bad place. When the Cold War ended, there was a brief moment when it looked as if the East-West divide was going to really narrow. Gorbachev was a transformative figure. He moved too far, too fast, and lost power. Yeltsin came in, unfortunately, was not the right man. He had democratic impulses. He did a lot of good, but he was sadly, an alcoholic. He couldn't really function as leader of Russia. And then Putin comes in. And Putin looks at what happened in those years. Remember, he's a KGB agent, who, by the way, at the beginning of the Yeltsin era, was a reformer in St. Petersburg. He was an aide to a very enlightened mayor of St. Petersburg who sort of faded over the years. If you had looked back at Vladimir Putin at that point, you might have thought he would be a worthy successor in some ways to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, but not the case. So he's loaded with grievances, as you understand from his public utterances. He believes that the West surrounded Russia with the expansion of NATO, that the West mistreated Russia after the Cold War ended, and for reasons that are inexplicable, seems to believe that Ukraine has no right to exist as a sovereign nation, that it's part and parcel of Russia. So the invasion is inexplicable, unnecessary, brutal beyond belief. To what end? I mean, how was Ukraine threatening Russia? It wasn't. And the idea that NATO was threatening Russia, I think, is ludicrous. I mean, if it had been me, I don't think I would have expanded NATO that much at the time. But NATO is not going to start a war unless Russia fires the first shot. And now this crazy business over the weekend, who knows what happened there? You've read the commentary. It's conceivable. Everything is conceivable from, although I think this is pretty unlikely, that this whole thing was cooked up actually by Putin and Prigozhin as some kind of theater of the absurd for some reason that we'll come to understand in the future. I dismiss that as unlikely. I think it was a clear mistimed mutiny, and I have no idea where it's going to lead. I would tell you, and I think most people who are far more knowledgeable about Ukraine and Russia than I am today would tell you this war could go on for years. It's a nasty, brutish war of attrition now. And until one side or the other really says, let's negotiate, the fighting will continue. I don't think Putin will use nuclear weapons. But I don't think you can rule out a use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, which would change world affairs drastically, because you never know what's going to happen after the first nuke is set off. Yeah.
When you were meeting with George Schultz at this close to his death,
right?
What did he want you to focus on? How did he think about showing himself?
Yeah, so I don't know if you could hear the question. Did Schultz have instructions for me about the book? How did he want himself to be depicted? So the backstory of the book is, it begins really when he was Secretary of State. I was covering him for the New York Times in the Washington Bureau, traveled around the world with him. got to know him a little bit, but the relationship between a diplomatic reporter and the Secretary of State is by necessity distant. But it was the beginning of a relationship. He asked me to play tennis with him a couple of times on these trips. I can tell you that was the most surreal experience, where you get out on the court and they're ball people. I mean, I never played in Wimbledon, so, there are people picking up the balls and handing them to you. There's the State Department doctor is on right there with his bag in case the secretary, becomes ill. And I get out on the court and I think, okay, so what's the protocol here? Can I beat the Secretary of State? So fortunately, he defused that issue by saying, let's just volley. So I knew him a little bit. And then I come out to Stanford, retire from the Times in 2008. And I start work on a book about him, Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry, the former defense secretary, and Sam Nunn, the former senator from Georgia, who was chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. That's the book that Bob alluded to. It's called The Partnership, 5 Cold Warriors and their effort to ban the bomb. And at one point, Schultz pulls me aside and says, would you be interested in writing my biography? I said, well, I'm flattered you would ask me. But I'm working on this book. I don't think I can give you an answer for a year or two. He said, that's okay. To encourage me to do it, he said, go into my archive and look at anything you want. That's where I found this Ray Seitz journal, which was really important in my decision to do the book. So the day comes where I go to Schultz, I'm done with the other book. And I said, okay, I'd love to do the book if you're still interested in having me do it. But here we have to have an understanding. It's your life, but it's my book. Because I'm not going to give up my journalistic independence to do your biography. And if you want a court biography, a hagiographic depiction of your life and career, I'm sure you can find somebody to do that. That's not the book I'm going to write. And you know what? To your direct question, I spent 10 years working on this book. I showed him most of the chapters before he died. Not once did he try to alter the content. And, if you read it, you'll see there's some pretty tough chapters in there about Iran-Contra, about Watergate, there's a lot about Theranos. It is far from a hagiographic book about George Shultz, but he understood that he was best served, I think, by having an independent journalist write the book with the good and the bad in it. So, yeah. I don't know how much time I should take questions. Are we exhausting your?
No, 5 minutes or so.
Okay, please.
I just wondered, since it was with Eisenhower, the military-industrial complex came up through there.
Right.
Did he ever use that in the 80s, trying to cut back on the military and use that as an excuse?
No, as I said, he was a firm believer in American strength and the buildup. And in fact, there was an interesting moment. I was sort of thrown into this as a young reporter in the New York Times Washington Bureau. And one day, to my amazement, they said, go up to the Senate today. Schultz is giving testimony on US-Soviet relations, and Bernie Wertzman, who was the chief diplomatic correspondent, was out that day or something. So there I go. And I'm sitting in the Senate room and he's giving a speech about US-Soviet relations. And, I'm not really much of a student of US-Soviet relations at that point. And the testimony I hear is, we need to be strong. We need to be very strong. But then we have to put that strength to use to negotiate. And so I wrote a kind of story. George Shultz told the Senate yesterday, that he wants to improve US-Soviet relations. My counterpart at the Washington Post, Don Oberdorfer, who is far more experienced than I was, wrote a story saying that George Shultz repeated the Reagan administration's condemnations of the Soviet Union. So you can imagine how I felt, when the Post story pops up and it's like, oh, did I get it wrong? And so I finally discovered years later in reading Schultz's book, he stops the book at one point to talk about that testimony. And to my pleasant surprise, he said there were these two very different depictions in the Times and the Post. The Times was right. So bless him for that. One last question. Anybody? All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And I will happily sign